This podcast is brought to you by the Average Intelligence Podcast.
Happy Tuesday and welcome to the AI Analysis Podcast. Today we're looking at another blog post from artemedia.org.
That's right. This one's called Nashville Shooting Shows Media Has Limits to Their Insanity.
Dated April 5th, 2023, so quite close to the events it discusses.
Yeah, very much in the immediate aftermath.
And our focus today is really getting inside the author's viewpoint,
Specifically focusing on that whole discussion around the shooter's identity that kind of blew up.
Exactly. We're going to, unpack the author's observations, their reactions as written, the conclusions they draw.
All aiming to understand the points this author is making about media, about society, just based on this one blog post.
So let's set the scene a bit, the context the author was writing in.
Okay, so the post came out, just over a week after the shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville. That was March 27th, 2023.
A truly horrific event. 3 children, 9 years old, and 3 adults lost their lives.
Just awful. And the author starts the piece on a personal note, actually, talking about their own mindset.
Yeah, they mention being or having been an optimist.
Right, but that current events over the past few years are making that extremely difficult. That's a direct quote.
So right away, you get this sense of weariness, disillusionment maybe.
Definitely. It kind of colors the whole perspective. You feel that coming through the text. They're writing from a place that feels shaped by a lot of tough recent history.
Absolutely. And the way the author describes the shooting itself, they use language suggesting it's depressingly common.
Mm-hmm. A story that has become all too familiar. That phrase really lands.
It suggests the author doesn't see these as isolated incidents, but as part of a deeply disturbing pattern.
Yeah. And then there's the characterization of the shooter's actions. It's very strong, very morally charged right from the get-go.
Extremely. Describing the perpetrator as a resentful person.
Acquiring weapons, seeking to be immortalized.
By committing the most selfish cry for attention imaginable at the expense of other people's lives. That's the full quote the author uses.
It's not just describing what happened, it's like interpreting the why behind it and framing that motive in really stark negative moral terms.
That focus on the selfish cry for attention part is interesting.
Yeah.
It puts the author's view of the motive squarely on the perpetrator's internal state, right? Resentment, wanting recognition.
Yeah, less about external factors, more internal. And the moral judgment, as you said, is just completely unambiguous.
The author puts down this really clear marker. They state, anyone who could feel the tiniest bit of sympathy for the shooter should examine their morality.
Wow. That's uncompromising.
It really is. It sets this non-negotiable stance against any kind of, justification or even emotional softness towards the perpetrator.
And it sets the stage for the whole analysis that follows, doesn't it? It tells you exactly where the author stands morally before they even get into the media critique.
Definitely. They're starting from absolute condemnation of the act and the person responsible.
So, okay. We have this somber, weary tone. The tragedy seen as part of a pattern. Strong condemnation. A clear moral line drawn about sympathy.
Right. And after laying all that out, the author describes a kind of shift, a specific moment where their focus on the aftermath took a particular turn.
Okay. So they were following the news like everyone else.
Yeah, keeping up with the details, and then a specific piece of information about the shooter comes out.
And the author says this specific detail really changed their perspective on how the story was being handled, especially by the media.
Exactly. This seems to be the real pivot in the blog post. Moving from that general moral condemnation to a much more focused critique of the media and the sort of societal reaction.
Okay, so what was the specific information?
It was the information that the murderer identified as transgender.
Ah, okay. And the author describes their immediate reaction to hearing that.
Yeah, quite directly. They write that their first thought was, okay, so was the shooter a man or a woman?
Interesting. So right away, the author frames it in that binary way, grappling with gender identity versus presumably biological sex. That's the immediate internal question they report having.
Yes. And then what the author describes happening next, in their own subjective experience, it feels, jarring.
Jarring how?
Given the context of the tragedy, the author says that learning this detail about the shooter's identity, a glimmer of hope appeared.
A glimmer of hope. Wow, okay. In the context of, multiple murders, including children, that phrase really stands out. It feels wrong almost.
It does, and the author seems acutely aware of how that might sound.
I would imagine so.
They immediately follow up, really emphatically stressing, absolutely nothing good came from this horrible act. Absolutely nothing.
Okay, so a very strong clarification.
Very strong. The author seems really concerned that this mention of hope could be twisted or seen as finding some positive aspect in the tragedy itself.
Which would contradict that strong moral stance they took earlier.
Exactly. So they explicitly state this hope was separate from the act. It's like they're building a wall between the awfulness of the crime and this other thing they want to talk about.
Why do you think that clarification was so critical for the author right at that moment?
Well, reading the text, it seems like they knew saying hope right after discussing the shooting could sound incredibly callous or insensitive if not explained.
Right, it could completely undermine their credibility or perceived empathy.
Precisely. So by drawing that sharp line, tragedy is 100% bad, full stop, my point about hope is about something else entirely. They're trying to safeguard their core moral position while still making this other point about the reaction.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a necessary distinction for the author to make. So if the hope wasn't about the tragedy, what was it about? What kind of further discourse were they hoping for?
The author says it was hope for further discourse in the country from this point on. And as you read on, it becomes clear this hope is tied directly to how the author perceived the media reacting to the shooter's trans identity.
Oh, okay. So it's about the media's reaction.
Yes. The author writes that their immediate interpretation of the media, even mentioning this detail, was that it showcased how completely out of reality our news media is.
So the hope wasn't that the media would suddenly align with the author's view of reality, but maybe that the media's handling of it, which the author saw as unreal, might spark a conversation.
That seems to be it. It's like a hope born from criticism. The author sees the media's focus here as disconnected from reality. The hope seems to be that this perceived disconnection, this out-of-reality moment, might be so blatant that it forces a wider public discussion about the media's relationship with reality itself.
So a hope for a kind of public reckoning, maybe? Triggered by what the author sees as a media misstep or a bizarre reaction in this specific high-stakes situation.
Exactly. It's not hope from the event, but hope that the response to a specific detail within the event might inadvertently expose something the author thinks is fundamentally wrong with the media.
And thereby maybe, just maybe, spark a different kind of public conversation, one the author presumably thinks is more grounded or necessary.
That seems to be the interpretation the text supports. It's hope for a specific kind of realization, triggered by media behavior, totally separate from the tragedy itself.
Okay, I think I get the author's distinction now, even if the initial phrasing is jarring, and this leads them to look closely at the actual language the media used.
Right. This becomes a really central pillar of their argument in the blog post. They zoom right in on the specific words chosen by major news outlets.
What was the key observation they made?
The author states that virtually every major media outlet was, and this is the author's specific framing and terminology, misgendering and dead-naming the shooter.
Okay, so the author is applying those specific terms to describe how the media referred to the perpetrator.
Yes. And it's probably helpful to quickly define how the author seems to be using those terms, aligning with common usage.
Right, so misgendering, in this context, the author means referring to the person using pronouns or gender terms that don't match the gender they identified with.
Exactly. So the author observed media using female pronouns for someone who reportedly identified as male.
And dead naming.
That's referring to a transgender person by their birth name or a name they use before transitioning instead of their chosen name.
Okay, so the author's observation is that major media outlets were consistently using, in the author's view, the shooter's birth name and female pronouns language tied to the sex assigned at birth.
Rather than the name and pronouns aligned with the shooter's identified gender, which seems to have been male. That's the core observation presented.
Got it. And the author's reaction to seeing this pattern in the media coverage.
It's described as a mix. They were legitimately surprised, but also felt a small sense of relief.
Surprised? Why? Did the author expect something different?
It seems so. Perhaps based on their general view of media trends around identity issues, the author might have expected major outlets to default to using the individual's preferred pronouns and name, even in this horrific context.
Okay, so the surprise makes sense from that perspective, but relief. Where does the relief come from?
This is where the author's interpretation really kicks in. They don't see this misgendering and dead naming as just, say, following police reports or an editorial choice based on initial confusion. They see it as a deliberate signal.
A signal of what?
The author's conclusion, as they write it, was, at least they acknowledge there is a line.
A line. Okay. So the author interprets the media's language choice here as evidence of boundaries, that there are limits to what major news outlets will, I guess, endorse or normalize.
Exactly, especially when faced with something as extreme as this particular crime.
And what is that specific line the author believes the media drew here?
The author states it very, very strongly. Their claim is that major media outlets will not defend or collaborate with a murderer of children to play make-believe that a girl can be a boy.
Wow. That is a very forceful claim.
It is. The author is directly linking the media's refusal, as the author sees it, to use the shooter's preferred pronouns name, to a refusal to engage in what the author explicitly calls play-make-believe.
And specifically in the context of a murderer of children.
Right. The author is essentially arguing that the sheer horror of the crime created a kind of reality check for the media, forcing them, in the author's view, to revert to language reflecting biological sex and birth name.
So it connects the specific language choice to a moral threshold. The author suggests that even for institutions they might otherwise see as detached from reality, this specific act was so heinous it made them draw a line against endorsing what the author considers a pretense or an untruth in this context.
That's the core of the author's analysis of that specific media behavior. They interpret it as the media prioritizing the gravity of the crime, and, in the author's view, biological reality over adhering to gender identity language norms they might apply elsewhere.
It's quite an interpretation. And interestingly, the author focuses on virtually every major media outlet doing this, but then they also point out an exception.
They do. They specifically bring up the Wikipedia entry for the Covenant shooting.
Well, what did they note about Wikipedia?
The author points out that the Wikipedia article did identify the perpetrator as male, formerly female, and use male pronouns and the chosen name.
Okay, so Wikipedia followed the shooter's self-identification.
Yes, according to the author. And the author presents this as a direct contrast to what they perceived the major media outlets doing.
What's the implication there? Why highlight Wikipedia specifically?
Well, it seems the author uses it to reinforce their point about the major media drawing a line. By showing that another prominent information source, like collaboratively edited Wikipedia, didn't draw that same line, it highlights the specific choice the author perceives the major outlets making.
So it suggests the author sees a divergence. Major news outlets acted one way, drawing a line in the author's view, while other platforms like Wikipedia acted differently, adhering to self-ID.
Exactly. It might imply, from the author's perspective, that the line wasn't universal across all public information spaces. It underscores for the author that different entities might set different boundaries around identity language, especially in these really fraught situations.
So, boiling down this section, the author uses the media's language around the shooter's identity, characterized by the author as misgendering and dead naming, as key evidence.
Evidence for their main thesis, suggested right in the title, that the media, despite what the author might see as other issues, still has limits to their insanity.
That seems to be the argument. This specific linguistic behavior becomes a crucial data point for the author, demonstrating that even entities they view critically will, in their interpretation, eventually hit a boundary when faced with something as extreme as this crime.
And this perceived boundary, this line, is framed by the author as the source of that initial, very jarring glimmer of hope.
Right. Not hope from the tragedy, but hope that the media's reaction to a specific detail within it might reveal something important about public discourse and reality, at least through the author's particular lens.
It's a complicated argument, for sure. Finding hope in what they perceive as the media drawing a line on identity language because the crime was so horrific.
It definitely is. It positions the media's language not just as reporting facts, but as a reaction that itself needs analyzing, potentially revealing the limits of their norms when faced with extreme violence and a perpetrator with a complex identity.
And this analysis of media language then kind of springboards the author into a broader critique of the societal response.
Which we can get into right after this quick break.
Sounds good.
Okay.
We'll be right back after a quick sponsor break.
We choose to go to the moon, participate, and do the other things.
Weird.
You know, someone said that frickin' Panera's Pepsi's taste funny.
Better.
No, I mean,
What?
And we're back.
We just covered the author's detailed analysis of media language regarding the shooter's identity, interpreting it as evidence the media drew a line. Now, the author broadens the scope.
Right, moving beyond just media language choices to critique the wider societal response, including certain activist groups.
And this part of the post seems to carry a lot of frustration, anger even.
Yeah, the author uses strong language here. They state it infuriates them.
Infuriates them that what?
That instead of remembering the victims, our society is now arguing over what pronouns to use for the perpetrator.
That's a really powerful statement of the author's core frustration here.
It absolutely encapsulates their perspective on what they see as a fundamental misdirection of focus after the tragedy.
The author clearly believes the conversation should have remained entirely on the victims, on the loss, on mourning.
And they perceive the actual discourse shifting, getting bogged down in debates about the perpetrator's identity, specifically pronouns. That's the shift they observed and are reacting strongly against.
It highlights the author's conviction about the proper societal response, remembrance, focus on the innocent. And they see the actual conversation as deviating from that moral imperative.
Yes, and that perceived deviation seems to be the source of the author's expressed anger in this section.
And they don't just critique the general discourse. They point fingers at specific groups, connecting their actions or words to this perceived misplaced focus.
They do. The author specifically brings up many of the trans activists who are still calling for violence in the name of trans acceptance. That's a direct quote of the author's claim.
Okay, that's a very serious allegation the author's making there.
It is, and the author follows that by characterizing this alleged behavior as shameless and lacking sense of tact.
And just to reiterate for you listening, our role here is to analyze the author's points as written in this specific blog post. We're reporting on the author's assertions and perspective to understand their argument, not independently verifying or endorsing these claims about activist groups.
Absolutely crucial distinction. We're examining the structure and content of this author's argument in this text.
Okay, so the author makes that strong claim. Do they provide any specific examples related to activist actions around that time?
Yes, they mention one specific event, the Trans Day of Vengeance.
Ah, yes, I recall that being in the news around then.
The author notes that the organizers of this event had enough sense to cancel the event.
Had enough sense. What does that phrasing tell you about the author's view of the event itself?
It clearly signals the author's disapproval of the planned event, especially the title Day of Vengeance, particularly in the context of the Nashville shooting having just happened.
It implies the author saw the event, or at least its branding, as tactless, insensitive, maybe even inflammatory given the timing.
Exactly, and framing the cancellation as the organizers having enough sense suggests the author views canceling it as the bare minimum of responsible behavior, a small positive acknowledgement of the context compared to actually holding it.
It fits into that broader critique the author is making about certain activist responses lacking tact or being inappropriate in the wake of the tragedy.
The author also circles back to the media language issue, the misgendering and dead naming they analyzed earlier, but this time commenting on who else was talking about it.
Okay, what do they observe there?
The author claims that very few, other than the radical and arguably mentally unstable activist class, are talking about the media misgendering the shooter.
Wow. Radical and arguably mentally unstable activist class. That is extremely charged language.
It's very strong, yes, and very dismissive. It functions to categorize and marginalize the group that the author perceives as being the main ones focused on the media's pronoun and name usage for the perpetrator.
By using terms like that, the author is reinforcing their own point that focusing on the perpetrator's pronouns is, in their view, a fringe concern, something only this group they label negatively would care about, especially after such a horrific event.
Right. It implicitly contrasts with the author's own focus, which was analyzing the media's choice as evidence of a line. The author seems to feel that the drawing of the line is significant and perhaps should be discussed more broadly, but observes that the actual discussion about the language is dominated by this group they critique.
Which leads directly into the author's concluding thought for this section, right? A kind of wish or maybe a disappointment.
Exactly. The author explicitly states it's a shame.
A shame about what?
A shame, the author wishes, that more than a few fringe players were pointing out that people on the left finally drew a line in the sand.
Okay, let's unpack that. The author sees the media's language choice, the misgendering, the dead naming, as proof.
Proof that entities the author associates with the left, which seems to include major media, maybe broader progressive circles in the author's mind, established a boundary in this specific case.
A boundary triggered by the extreme nature of the violence, the child murder.
That's the author's interpretation presented in the text. They see the specific instance as a significant moment where, in their view, ideological commitments to certain gender identity language norms were apparently overridden or limited by the severity of the crime, even by outlets the author aligns with the left.
And the author feels this perceived drawing of a line is a really notable event, something that validates their perspective on the media having limits.
Yes. And they're expressing disappointment that this specific observation isn't getting wider recognition or being highlighted by more commentators. They lament that, in their view, it's only being discussed by those they've already dismissed as fringe players.
It really connects back to that glimmer of hope idea from earlier, the hope for further discourse about media and reality.
It seems the author is disappointed that this particular point, their analysis that the media did draw a line here, isn't becoming a more central part of that discourse. They feel it's a significant revelation that's being missed or ignored by the mainstream.
Or only discussed by groups the author doesn't respect.
Right. The author feels this media reaction revealed something important about the limits of certain ideologies when confronted with extreme reality, and they regret that this specific point isn't being amplified more broadly.
It's quite a journey the author takes the reader on in this post, from the initial shock and condemnation,
To a very specific analysis of media language around identity.
and then broadening out to a critique of societal focus and activist responses.
And the whole thing is filtered through the author's distinct perspective on media trustworthiness, their definition of reality, and where they think political and social lines are, or should be, drawn, especially when facing something so terrible.
It really is a case study, isn't it? Using this specific, incredibly sensitive event and the reactions to the perpetrator's identity.
To make much larger claims about the media, about discourse, about identity politics, and about where societal focus ought to lie, according to the author.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. What are the main takeaways? What are the core themes driving this piece?
Well, first and foremost, there's a strong critique of the media, specifically arguing they're detached from reality. The handling of the shooter's identity is presented as prime evidence for this, but also, paradoxically, as evidence that even they have limits.
Okay, so media critique is central. What else?
The idea that this tragedy, because of its specific nature and the identity element, revealed perceived boundaries in public discourse. A line in the sand, as the author puts it, particularly around identity issues when faced with horrific violence like the murder of children.
And the third major theme?
I think it's that deep frustration we discussed. The author's strong critique of what they see as a misplaced societal focus, arguing that the conversation shifted wrongly to the perpetrator's identity and pronouns, instead of staying centered on the victims and the sheer gravity of the loss.
Yeah, that frustration about the focus shifting from victims to the perpetrator seems like a really powerful undercurrent throughout the second half of the blog post.
Absolutely. It feels like a core motivator for the author's entire analysis and commentary beyond the initial description of the event. It drives the anger and the critique.
So if we step back and think about what this author's perspective offers, I mean, analyzing how media and society reacted to these complex identity issues right after such extreme violence, what does this specific viewpoint reveal for you, the listener?
Well, it really throws into sharp relief the ongoing tensions, doesn't it? Tensions between different social narratives, different ideas about the role of media, and how collective grief and identity politics can clash or intersect in really difficult ways in the public square.
And that line in the sand, the author perceives the media drawing in this instance. What might that suggest, from this author's viewpoint, about future conversations when identity and tragedy collide?
From this author's perspective, presented in the blog post, it could suggest a potential point of friction or pushback. It might signal, in their view, a limit to how readily certain identity frameworks are applied by some commentators or institutions when confronted by the stark moral weight of extreme violence, especially involving children.
It implies that, for this author, certain realities, certain moral boundaries, might sometimes override or challenge prevailing social norms around identity language at least in some quarters.
Exactly. It underscores just how incredibly sensitive, complex, and contested that space remains the intersection of identity, grief, media representation, and the public search for meaning after something horrific.
It really does give you a lot to think about. How different people interpret events, how they analyze media, how they decide what the focus should be after a tragedy.
And how deeply those interpretations are often intertwined with broader social, political, and ideological viewpoints. It shows how even in shared grief, the narratives we use, the language we prioritize, can become sites of intense debate, revealing these underlying tensions in society.
It's a stark illustration indeed.
Mm-hmm.
And that wraps up our analysis of this particular blog post.
Always interesting to unpack these perspectives.